The title obviously is Questioning the Place of Subjective States in Conscious Awareness and Anomalous Healing. The operative word here is questioning. I'm not going to come to any firm conclusions here. I'm going to just question, in my healing research, how much subjective states really matter. And I understand that a lot of this is going to be a little bit heretical. So I'm going to give you the plot, and a number of you are familiar with my plot. I've been doing healing work for a bunch of decades, and I'm going to focus here on just a selected part, some of which many of you have seen before, some cancer cures. I can do this very quickly. And then I'm going to focus on the problem. And the problem will be this. Do you have to be in a particular state of mind to produce healing? Do you have to know that you're healing? So out there in healing land, there are people who say, well, you need to be spiritual, you need to be in this altered state, you need to be in that altered state, you need. And I'm going to question that and wonder whether or not healing is actually an autonomic process. And probably a number of you will get mad at me. So the plot. A number of you have seen this. I've worked with a number of types of cancer. In this particular series of experiments, I've done 8 of these. We're dealing with a mammary cancer. We're doing this in a mouse model. And really the only thing that you need to focus on is, as York said yesterday, we know with 100% certainty that after injection with this particular form of cancer, the mice will be dead within 27 days. And this has happened in 10,000 experiments. And so this particular type of cancer is non-metastatic. It grows. It's easy to measure, et cetera, et cetera. And so this would be the mouse. And you're going to watch a mouse non-metastatically grow and grow and grow until you have a very ugly-looking thing. And the mouse dies either of having the internal organs being crushed or malnutrition or some combination. It's not a good way to go. Now, in my experiments, I never worked with healers. That sounds odd because I'm doing a healing experiment. I don't work with healers. I don't take, people who this is their day job and all that. The criteria I use, it's really quite simple. The only people I use are very, very, very good-looking people. And I found, I think, with fair degree of certainty that ugly people can't heal. And beautiful people don't need to know any healing techniques. So if you take really good-looking people and they put their hands around a cage, weird stuff happens. The tumor grows, which I didn't expect. The tumor gets a blackened area. The tumor ulcerates. The tumor implodes. And the mice live their normal lifespan. This is in a model with previously 100% fatality. So it's pretty interesting. So this is an example of what happens if you do these treatments. Tumor grows. It's hard to see where you are, but the tumor is actually developing a blackened area. It develops a slit. It develops an ulceration. And we thought when this was originally happening that we thought something was going wrong, but it turns out this is a good thing. And if we saw subsequent slides, you would see this thing implode into itself. The mice are cured. And I say cured because they're cured for life. They're immune to re-injections of the cancer. We can take parts of the tumor, implant it into a fully infected mouse, and it'll cure that mouse. So it's pretty interesting. Also do this with different types. We've done a couple of experiments using sarcomas. These are not quite as aggressive. They have 100% death, but it takes a little bit longer for them to die. This, too, is non-metastatic, so you simply have a growth. If we do the hands around the cage kind of a thing, we get a couple things happen. Sometimes the tumor develops this similar type of ulceration. The mouse joins the arm and becomes a sergeant. Other times, the tumor simply collapses and the mice mysteriously grow an arrow on their back. And so you get more variety of response in these sarcomas. If you put a person in a cage and do this, you get complaints, but you also have similar things that you can find. So this is MRI data of breast cancer, and you're looking at things you don't want to look at, and then you're looking at things you want to look at. Again, there's a natural healing process that goes on in the breast cancer. We can follow this by thermal imaging. We can follow this by blood tests. We can follow this in a whole variety of ways. And so I guess essentially I'm saying it works with mice, with men, we've done this in cancer labs on you name it. There's some pretty interesting findings. It seems that the rate of remission is inversely related to mass, and there's a number of other things I could go into, but not today. And so given a whole bunch of experiments, and this is essentially a summation of what I led up to in a talk at the University of Virginia, I have 7 propositions in decreasing order of certainty. And so I go to the first one, and this is a no-brainer at this point. Experimentally, there's really not any ambiguity to it. Cancer can be cured using energy healing. I'm reasonably certain that once cured, it's cured for life. A little less certain there's a dose response. The more aggressive the cancer, the easier it is and the faster it is to fix. I'm less certain healing occurs in bursts. And the thing I'm least sure of is that healing can be taught. And it turns out this is a pretty methodologically complex problem to solve. And I've actually had people yelling and screaming at me because they say, you know, you're an idiot. Of course it can be taught. I was taught, now I heal, you know, all that kind of stuff. But it turns out there really are no good pre-post experiments to see whether the stuff that you learned helped you to heal. So maybe you start, you could heal anyway. I'm the only one dumb enough to try it. And then you learn X, Y, and Z technique, and it turns out you know better than you would have been anyway. So I think it's a separate but interesting question. Do specific healing techniques produce specific results? You know, things along those lines. So here's my propositions in decreasing order of certainty that I've come to, you know, certain conclusions in all of the research I've done, and I've done quite a bit. And now what I'm trying to do is superimpose onto this the question of what's the place of subjective states. Do subjective states matter? And would I be sure subjective states matter, or I could be sure subjective states don't matter, down to, I don't know, you know, that kind of thing. So I'm kind of adding the 8th factor. That's the point of this talk. Do subjective states matter? Do you have to be spiritual? Do you have to be in a particular state of mind? Things along those lines. So what are the states of consciousness during healing sessions? Can it be objectively measured? What are the subjective self-reports of the volunteer healers? I've used faculty members, I've used student volunteers, I've used a bunch of people. The only criterion, this is actually a limiting factor to all my experiments, is all of them are non-believers with no experience. So I don't know whether believers can heal. I don't know whether experienced people can heal. I know non-experienced non-believers don't have a problem with it, so now I'm trying to place within that what is the importance of subjective states of consciousness. Now, I want to put this in two ways. One, healing with conscious intent, what happens and what can we measure? And then I'm going to broaden this to say what happens if you don't know what's going on? And this is where it becomes a little bit more interesting, a little more dicey. So the first one, bonding between human subjects, and I'm putting that under conscious intent. Some of you may have read the winter 2010 version of JSE. This was done with Luke Hendricks and Jay Gunkelman. Luke's out here someplace. And so we're hoping to continue this EEG kind of data. And so what we're looking at is consciously, can someone consciously, thinking of another person, what happens? Can we measure something between the people trying to consciously link? And for those of you who read or didn't read, we got some pretty interesting data. We found intra-brain harmonics and interbrain phase locking. It's pretty interesting. So it's already published. It's out in JSE. You know, I'm not going to focus on this, and we did a variety of pretty interesting kinds of analysis. I've also done a whole bunch, these are not published, of functional MRI data, and now we're talking about consciously trying to link with another person. Unfortunately, it's only using one MRI. I want to do it with synchronized MRIs, but we're talking about, in these sets of slides, it's me as the volunteer. So I'm the volunteer sitting in an MRI, lying in an MRI, and there is a person out there, and I'm trying to think in on-off modes in an ugly, noisy environment. Can you produce something that has any reliability? This is me in a control. You can see absolutely nothing happens in my brain. It's actually pretty interesting. You can look in one side and clearly see out the other. However, if you start to think about healing in on-off mode, you get pretty interesting and pretty reliable on-off states. You get pretty interesting and pretty reliable on-off states. You get pretty interesting and pretty reliable on-off states. There's going to be a theme here. You get pretty interesting and pretty reliable on-off states. And so these are essentially completely reliable. It's up to you to decide whether it's interesting. And some of the effect sizes are pretty strong. Those of you who do MRI data, you're probably not used to seeing 25% changes in signal strength. This is pretty strong stuff, and it's 100% reliable. Now, here comes the interesting part. I mean, some of this was also interesting, but here comes some really interesting parts. What happens if you're not conscious about what's going on? So here's the experiment we did. And this is a pilot. Again, I'm the volunteer. I'm lying in an MRI. So you imagine that I'm lying in an MRI. It's an enclosed MRI, and the only thing sticking out is my left hand. Into my left hand, in on-off kind of mode, double-blind, are dropped envelopes. Some of the envelopes have index cards in them, which are blank. Some of the envelopes have index cards in them, or have, instead of the index card, have a picture of a cancerous animal 600 miles away with also a hair sample of that animal. So we take a couple of snippets. We got these from a veterinarian in another state, doesn't matter. And so the snippets of hair samples and pictures are from them. They're all double-blinded, so I'm lying in this ugly MRI, and I'm just kind of hanging out thinking, you know, why am I here? What's going on? And you can feel, of course, when an envelope hits your hand. And if something happens and hits your hand, there's going to be a response in the brain. So my conscious state is lying in an MRI, thinking sooner or later somebody's going to be putting something into my hand. That's about the extent of my awareness. I feel something go into my hand, then they take something away from my hand. Then they put something into my hand, then they take something away from my hand. And this goes on for quite a while. I've spent 13 hours in an MRI so far. I'm fine. My protons are a little spun, but I'm fine. So I'm there, and I have no conscious awareness other than a tactile sense that something has touched my hand. Here's the interesting part. The images are the same. But the images are the same as you just saw, only when there's an active envelope. So if something hits the hand, and it's just a tactile sense, the brain goes, something just touched your hand. If there's a picture of a hair sample, a picture and a hair sample of a cancerous animal hundreds of miles away, my brain goes on. And I could throw in a kicker, but I won't. If I did, I'd say the animals also got cured, but I won't mention that. And so my brain knows the difference. I don't. And this is the distinction I'm trying to make. I don't know. I'm feeling and then not feeling and then feeling and then not feeling and then feeling and not feeling. That's all I know. I can't, if you asked me psi hitting, you know, kind of a thing, I would completely crap out, I'm sure. You know, I'd be completely a chance. But my brain, and this is to 100% reliability, switches on when there's a need, I don't know how to phrase this, requested. When a need is present, the brain turns into healing mode. And we get the same images as if I'm sitting in the MRI trying to go, intend to heal. Stop intending to heal, which is really a weird thing to do in the first place. Intend to heal, stop intending to heal. That's pretty interesting. So this is a double-blinded procedure, and there's no conscious awareness of the difference between the envelopes. Again, I'm quite confident I would flunk a psi test. Now, a couple things, then we'll come back to more complications. So, additional selected facts from these experiments. Cancer certainly can be cured by inexperienced healers. I'm not a healer. Belief doesn't seem to matter. A sense of spirituality doesn't appear to be necessary. So, in all my volunteers, who are, again, faculty and students, the only criteria to get into my experiments is that you have to laugh in my face when I tell you what you're going to do. There's a wide range. None of them believe in healing, but some of them say during the course of their healing procedures, I felt a connection. Some of them say, I felt no connection. Some of them don't know how to spell connection. Those would be the students. And so I've asked them, who are they, where do they come from, what they feel, all this, and it's just, I can't find a pattern. I can't find a pattern in their subjective experience. I can't find a pattern in the things they believe. I can't find any pattern at all. And so I'm wondering, what is the pattern necessary to produce this? Or maybe we're even asking the wrong question. Maybe these questions of subjective sense or being there or whatever you want to call it, maybe we're asking the wrong question. And the rate and speed of remission doesn't seem to be related to a subjective sense of spiritual connection. I think that's interesting. But, there's always a but. I think Dean had the record for the most buts in that. The end line, yeah. There's always a but. There is, in my experiments, a problem of resonant bonding, which can produce type 2 errors. And by resonant bonding, I don't like this word, and I probably shouldn't even have it up there. In my healing experiments, we have difficulty in these models that have 100% death getting the controls to die. And it turns out, really simplifying this, you can read it in a bunch of my papers, but it turns out that if somebody who knows these healing techniques becomes even aware of the controls, they remit. They can be dying along until they become exposed to the controls, and then the controls go through the remission process. And that's pretty interesting. And it doesn't even happen in a morphogenetic field effect. It goes selectively from cage to cage. It skips cages. It depends which one. You don't even have to know which controls or that the controls exist. There can be extra control mice in extra control rooms and extra control cages. They remit too. It's really annoying. And so a treatment given to an experimental group will also result in a treatment given to a control group, which makes it difficult to do a dose response test. So I've done experiments with 25 mice. It turns out they get cured slower than if I do an experiment with 75 mice. In 75 mice, there has to be more treatments. The more treatments there are, doesn't mean to any particular mouse, the more treatments there are to any mice, the faster the entire group goes through the remission process. That's pretty interesting. So the larger the number of mice, the faster the mice go through the remission process. Do an experiment with 100 mice, it'll go faster than if you do an experiment with 25 mice. And so this has a whole bunch of methodological implications to it. And you could see from earlier, can healing be taught? Well, I don't know. Here's why I don't know. Let's say I take the front row of people here and I give them all a cage of mice. If there's this bonding, loosely entanglement between mice, do I know, and they're all successful in doing it, do I know that each person was able to do it, or did one person do the whole lot? Could they have done it before? So I got a pre-post problem, I got a bonding problem. Bonding problems make life really complicated. And so, take this and make it farther. So I've got cage, 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 cage. You all come, you're part of my experiment. All the mice get fixed. I don't have any spiritual thoughts whatsoever. Did you feel a connection? Yeah, I felt a connection. Did you feel I didn't feel a connection. So I get all these subjective reports. I don't know. Maybe all the cure really came from those who were bonded. Maybe the cure really came from those who were spiritual. Or, let's be heretical, maybe it came only from those who weren't. And the answer is, empirically, of course, I don't know, because of this bonding methodological complication. And so I asked the question, might healing really be an autonomic response to need? Think, in the tube, brain turns on, brain turns off, brain turns on, brain turns off. I don't do it. And a subjective sense of connection follows. There's a chicken-egg problem. That's not a chicken-egg problem. I solved that one. It's a chicken. But in this particular case, I'm still confused. So maybe the subjective sense of connection is there, but maybe it's a consequence of autonomic response to need, which kicks in healing, and then you feel connected. Why? Because you feel connected. Why? Because there needs to be a connection. So we may have the causal order backwards. And of course, the whole thing may be the wrong question. But maybe instead of saying, I need to have this spiritual stuff, and then this happens, maybe this happens, and the spiritual stuff is perceived, sensated, to follow. I don't know. I think these are worth checking out. So where should we place the importance of subjective states? I'm sure, I don't know, where do you put subjective states? Well, in the context of the methodological bonding problem, I'm not sure where to put it. So this is simply a report without a conclusion of things that I'm trying to figure out now, and adding to it, I guess, an eighth proposition. And this is going to require a whole lot of experiments to try to tease out. I'm done.
We have lots of time for questions, and I'm going to take advantage of my position of power and ask the first one. This idea of need is really interesting. And I know there are healing practices where they don't pray for cure, or pray, I'll just use that word, but that the best thing happens. And just like the mice have a finite life, so does a human body. So those mice aren't supposed to die. They are injected with this cancer.
Yes.
And so this need for healing, because it's unnatural that they have this cancer. And the fact that when you increase the number, the need is bigger and the healing happens faster. So what is your opinion about what would happen if this was aimed at people that weren't necessarily, they didn't have a cancer, but that they were ailing and getting toward nearing death? Would it help people?
It's a wonderful question, and frankly, I like to ask very simple questions, and I want to do a simple 2x2 design. And I've talked to Luke about this. I want to do it with EEG stuff. I want to do it with fMRI. I want to do it with, but the 2x2 design would be people that I have a previous connection with, and people I don't have a previous connection with, and people who have need, and people who don't have need. And would there be a difference in the simple 2x2 design in an autonomic response in the brain? Would it matter in terms of an intention trying to bond? Could we get the phase locking of the brain? Now, notice even the bias that we have here. So I grant the article, the phase locking of the brain is pretty interesting, but notice then that we also then have a brain bias. So there's no, I can't claim that although we see the phase locking of the brains, that it's when the phase locking occurs that's when healing occurs. In the previous JSE, I have a paper out with Margaret Moga on geomagnetic micropulsations and healing, and it turns out we get changes in physical space around. But I don't know whether that's when healing occurs. So something anomalous happens, and you get weird-looking waves, and it almost looks like you get reverse entropy from time to time. And so a lot of interesting correlates, but is that when it happens? Does healing happen? Is it a process? Does it burst in?
Who cares?
The answer, I do. That was the simplest question you could ask. I do. Yeah. Yeah.
But everyone's healed, and that's the end of it.
Well, I mean, I grant that the higher purpose would be to save the rodents, but I'd also like to know the mechanism.
Yeah, Dr. Bengston, a question about the way in which
we never use doctor at the SSE.
That's
Bill.
fine.
Bill, please.
Where the methodologies that your healers used, did you look at the difference between only thinking about healing or not even thinking at all, or putting your hands around the cage with a mouse in it, or putting your hands on the mouse or near the mouse?
We've tried, I take that to mean you're skeptical about my good-looking hypothesis. Yeah. We've done a variety of dose response. We've tried treating once a week, 3 times a week, 5 times a week, 5 at a time, 10 at a time. We've done all these permutations. But I did all those permutations before I found the resonant bonding problem. And with the resonant bonding problem, it becomes ugly. So I have, if I'm doing once a week, 3 times a week, 5 times a week, I've tried just treating the water to mice I've never met. They get cured. But I don't now know whether it's the water. So at one time, I had all these wonderful conclusions, but I was treating this as a nice, simple, mechanical experiment, just changing the parameters to see how the outcome changes. But with the resonant bonding problem, it turns out to be really, really complicated. So the short answer is, yeah, I've tried these things, but I don't know how to conclude at this point.
Thank you.
Hi, Bill.
Hey, Dick.
Had a couple.
That's Dr. Bengston to you.
And it's Dr. Blasbane to you. We go way back. I'm a healer too, so I know of where Bill speaks, and I know the mice he's worked with. I use them extensively in many experiments. I have a couple problems with your presentation.
I have many.
Well, a couple will start, okay? I think that there is quite a bit of confusion about the concept of energy healing and resonant bonding. I too thought that this was an energy that one is transmitting from oneself to whomever I was working with or whatever animals I was working with. But when you begin to get into, excuse me, non-local healing, then that becomes a specious explanation. So the idea of resonant bonding, of course, makes that a far more, non-local healing a far more possible, because all you have to do really is set up some kind of resonance between yourself and whatever is out there without necessarily any energy transmission. Although energy may be involved at the source and at the end, but all that has to be specified. And to call it energy healing, I think, sets up a bias and an expectation in those who are doing research, because once you get on that track, it's hard to get off it. I think we're far better off just saying we don't know what goes on here. And also, along that line is, and I think that you're getting to this, you alluded to the question of the brain. And you're wondering whether there is an autonomic, spontaneous kind of thing which is involved here. And I think that that's a very worthwhile avenue to pursue. That my personal experience is that while the brain is there, it is an epiphenomenon when it comes to healing. I don't think need really plays a role here. This is an anthropomorphizing of the issue. There is some other function, though, which does take place, and we don't know what it is. And it comes from a very deep level. And here I like to, in my own thinking, I like to invoke the John Donne M5 hypothesis, which does, take account of the role of the unconscious mind and intangible physical reality. We don't know what is taking place in intangible physical reality when we're doing healing, but presumably something. That's really all I want to say about it. I see what you're doing as attempting to break through a bias which came with your education, all of our education. We're all practically everybody here is educated in a reductionistic, materialistic, mechanistic point of view, and we scramble to get out of it to attempt to understand these strange phenomena. And I think that with all that you're doing, that this is one of the major things that you're doing. And I congratulate you on doing it and keeping yourself so open to all of these various hypotheses.
Thank you. I'd agree with you on energy healing. The conventional idea of energy, of course, would imply that the information or the signal or the effect should diminish with distance, and in my experiments it does not. I've replicated this at 2 feet and 2,000 miles. I get the same results. You and I would disagree a little bit about the role of intent, and I question very, very much, this is the basis of this talk, where does intent fit in all this?
What do you want to do, boss? Keep going or move?
You're the program, you're running this.
Oh, I'm the boss? Let's go. There's a lot of, let's go 2 more questions.
Okay.
Your comment on the control group issue and the fact that the control groups became part of the system brings to mind what happened in the early days of remote viewing research at SRI. We couldn't really find a control group because anybody that was designated as controls eventually could do just as well.
Yeah.
But the issues I saw there were it was the entire environment. Now, what would happen if you were not even close to the experimental situation and turn it over to your subordinates, if you will, and let them move ahead with the protocols that you have? Do you think you get the same result?
My answer to almost all questions is very simple. I don't know, but it's absolutely worth testing. I've actually spoken to a number of people here at this meeting who are intending on replicating it, and I would like to go down many generations to see if this occurs with reliability.
2 quick ones. That resonant entanglement or bonding seems to undercut the control aspect of the experiment.
Yeah.
How do you deal with it? I mean, that's a very significant problem.
Yeah, and that's the reason I have difficulty trying to place this, how to interpret it. It's one of the reasons that I've had to actually publish a paper retracting a claim I've made 10 years earlier that healing could be taught. I hadn't thought it through.
But
frankly.
even more fundamentally, how does it interflect with the fact that healing happens at all? Maybe.
Oh,
it's a
that
chance
healing
phenomenon.
happens, my control, I mean, that's the perfect question. Under normal circumstances, if there was a possibility of different outcomes, I would be more confused. But I know, given my control is not the control in these experiments where I'm taking and randomly separating mice. My control really becomes a quasi-control of 10,000 previously conducted experiments. And so I know what should happen. When you have all of them getting better in knowing what should happen, that's where I say, and I have a paper out, we have the possibility, if there is this kind of bonding, of type 2 errors, where you think nothing happened. The only reason I can say with certainty something happened is because there are 10,000 experiments that say these mice should be dead. And I've done this in now 6 different labs, med schools, by people and labs. This is their day job. So they've never had this. And so I'm reasonably certain.
Last quick one. How does the brain know what's in the envelope? Just your thoughts.
How does brain know?
How does your brain know what's in the envelope?
Oh, I can answer with the same certainty. I don't know.
I don't know. Thank you, Bill.